Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, shot on Royal Artillery Historical Fire Plan 001. Welcome. I hope you're all well. Extraordinary times that we live in. We're just shy of 40 who are going to join us tonight. We're just over halfway there. A few more will continue to join us, but we're off. So thank you very much. This is our smoke tester. Are we behind the times here? I sense not. It's a question of which times we're talking about. While this isn't going to replace our physical meetings, I have a feeling this is really going to complement the future of the society, and notably bringing the serving regiment on board. So let's put down a few rounds tonight, see which way the smoke blows, and take it from there. We're hugely privileged tonight to be joined by the Royal Artillery historian, Spencer Jones. Now I'll warn you now, Spencer is an old hand at this. And I know we've got celebrity chefs, we've got celebrity dancers, but I sense COVID and virtual lecturing has now given us the celebrity historian. And noting that Spencer is one of the best dressed academics on the circuit, we must benefit from his support as the RA historian before he goes Hollywood and hits the big time. You've seen his biography, hugely impressive. You've also seen some of the Western Front Society lectures that he's done, which we've circulated. Spencer has a real relevance in terms of where we are now, based on where we've come from. And actually, Spencer, sometimes I don't think you understand the full relevance you have, and I'll have to tell you sort of offline how some of those elements are still playing out today, because it's hugely pertinent, which is why you add such value as the Royal Artillery historian. You've also seen that Spencer's book is about to be republished in hardback. This is covering leadership in 1914 in the First World War. And I was in a webinar today with colleagues from Wolverhampton University talking about this very subject. But tonight he's going to take us back to what I think, at least, it's dangerous for me to say this, is the genesis of the artillery that we know today, or at least knew up until the point we had cyber and satellites, etc. And that's the Second Boer War. Because 1914 wasn't a standing start. The British Expeditionary Force was at that point because of what had happened previously. And Spencer is the acknowledged expert in this field. Spencer, we're delighted to have you with us this evening. We very much look forward to what you have to say. I'll just remind everybody the rules of the road. I know it's a bit impersonal to put question and answers, or questions at least, on the chat or the email, but I'll act as ringmaster. It does make it easier because it allows us to avoid duplication and to keep things going. I've got to also admit a sin. I was on a Royal Engineers webinar last night. It was only their second, so okay, we're in the race. You know, we are closing them down. But actually, it did work really well. So we'll hopefully achieve that tonight. Spencer, without further ado, the session is yours.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to all of everyone who's joined me this evening. Very, very, very kind introduction from John. He flatters me too much. But one point he did make in that introduction is a point that I wish to pick up in this talk, and that is, of course, that the learning curve that we often think of in the First World War, that process of the British Army and the Royal Artillery in particular getting better as the war went on, did not begin when the war started. It actually began a decade earlier in the Boer War. And I'm going to take you back to a pivotal battle in that war, where the beginnings, the first glimpses of modern war, perhaps as the British Army perceived it, are visible. And John, I need to ask you now if you could allow me to share my screen so I can put the PowerPoint up. John? Okay. Well, at the moment we
Two seconds, Spencer. I'm just working out what I'm on here.
Okay. These things do happen.
You should be okay. Does that work?
That's worked perfectly. So now the slides should be visible for you on the screen. They certainly are on my screen. So the title of this talk is called Simply Flogged by Lead, and the origin of that phrase I will reveal to you by the end of the talk. And it concerns the Battle of the Tugela Heights, fought over a period of a fortnight in February 1900. The Tugela Heights, still there, still well worth a visit should any of you ever have the chance to be in South Africa, but they are not a battle that received a great deal of recognition in their own period and perhaps they've received even less subsequently. With the exception of the great Boer War historian Thomas Pakenham, interest in the Battle of the Tugela Heights is limited to a handful of specialists, of which I, of course, am one. But I hope that by giving this talk this evening, I at least inspire an interest for many of you in this battle, which repays a close study, I must say, a battle which changed the nature of how the British Army would perceive war, and those lessons would be equally relevant 14 years later in France and Belgium as they were on the Tugela Heights in South Africa in 1900. How did we reach the Tugela Heights? Well, first of all, we need a little bit of background. Now, I'm sure that most of you here are familiar with the broad outline of the Boer War, but it's always good to have a refresher on the situation. The Boers came from the two small republics of Transvaal, as you can see here, the larger of the two, and Orange Free State. They had a long history of acrimony with the British. Britain had, to an extent, inherited South Africa at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Cape Town had been captured in 1806 from the Dutch, and then the entire continent, or southern half of the continent, had been signed over to the British in 1815 in the treaty that ended the Napoleonic Wars. But with the taking over of South Africa, Britain also took responsibility for the Boers. The Boers did not share a language, they did not share a legal system, and they didn't really share a religion. Boer religion, of course, famously Old Testament and rather dour and rather intense compared to the more easygoing Church of England. British legal systems brushed up against Boer legal systems in the early part of the 19th century, culminating in, of course, the abolition of slavery. The Boers practiced a peculiar form of slavery in South Africa, a sort of indentured servitude, if you will, but one that the British quite rightly recognised as slavery, and it was to be abolished. For the Boers, this was the trigger point which prompted the Great Trek East, as the Boers undertook a mass migration from Cape Town in the west, and indeed Cape Colony, into the new lands that would eventually become Transvaal and Orange Free State. That, of course, took them away from the British, but soon acrimony would resume. The British closed in on the Boer republics. A war was fought between them in the early 1880s, which actually culminated in a Boer victory at Majuba Hill, which allowed the Boers to assert their independence. But that independence was under threat the moment that major gold and diamond reserves were discovered in the country just a few years later. The British Empire coveted these republics and their mineral wealth, and these republics, which had essentially defined their history out of opposing the British, were determined not to give up that independence. It all culminated in October 1899 with the outbreak of the Second Boer War. And the Boers struck first, of course, advancing into British territory, notably Natal here, defeating the British Field Army at the outskirts of Ladysmith, and actually imprisoning that army in Ladysmith itself, a relatively small junction town to the north of the Tugela River. And the campaign to actually relieve Ladysmith would bring a British army to the Tugela Heights that we're going to be talking about this evening. In December 1899, British relief forces marching to the aid of the besieged towns of Kimberley here in the west and Ladysmith here in the east, as well as also trying to secure this area here, the so-called Cape Midland area, all met defeat in a period known as Black Week, a series of grave setbacks which results in a reshuffle of command and the appointment of Lord Roberts to take charge of the army. But the campaign in Natal to relieve Ladysmith continued despite this change of supreme command. What was happening there? Well, the problem that the British faced was that the Boers had advanced south from Ladysmith towards the Tugela River, marked in blue here, so you can see it quite clearly, and had taken up very strong positions on the hills and the bluffs on the north side of the river, and also to the east of the river here, or at least into this rough bushy country as noted on the map. This was a stern position to assault. The Tugela River, over 300 miles long, broad at this point, slow flowing, but also deep and difficult to cross. And although there are various drifts, natural crossing points that existed, of course the Boers defended these fiercely. The bridges over the Tugela at this point, only one of which could take an army, the one at Colenso, had been blown by the Boers. And so the British were faced with a very, very difficult proposition of assaulting across a river. The man in charge of this army, who we'll discuss subsequently, Reevers Buller VC, launched 3 separate assaults at various points in an attempt to fight his way north to Ladysmith. Perhaps the most famous of these, or at least most notorious for the Royal Artillery, is of course the Battle of Colenso on the 15th of December 1899, an attempt to directly breach the river crossings at 2 points, miscarried horribly with the loss of 11. I'll say that again, with a loss of 10 British artillery pieces. Colonel Long's 2 batteries disabled, or disabled perhaps for want of ammunition rather than enemy fire, in the field, not able to be retrieved by the end of the day, and the Boers dragged them away and actually, in some cases, repurposed them for use against the British. That was the assault at Colenso. It was followed just over a month later with a disastrous battle at Spion Kop. These 2 battles costing the British over 2,000 casualties each. I put a plus next to the casualties from Spion Kop, as these casualties may be underestimated. There may well have been more losses, and indeed, depending on how one calculates the casualties from Spion Kop, it could have been closer to 2,000 casualties at this battle, a disastrous effort to try and outflank the Boers. And in February, there was a farcical battle at a place called Valkrans. Valkrans is just across here, it's just across the river, where the British advanced essentially into a salient, were unable to press it forward, suffered casualties trying to fight forward, and eventually Buller withdrew his troops. So the 3 efforts to try and relieve Ladysmith had failed. Now, Ladysmith had been under siege by this point from the end of October onwards, and there was some concern about how much longer Ladysmith could hold out. The Boers certainly hoped that Ladysmith would crumble and give them a much-needed morale-boosting victory, not to mention freeing up a substantial number of Boer troops who were besieging it, and the British needed to relieve that force to prevent exactly this happening. So the pressure was high in February as Buller planned his 4th attempt. Rivers Buller himself is an interesting character. You may have seen him recently in the news because, of course, his statue in the city of Exeter was briefly under threat due to his perceived misdeeds in the past. That threat seems to have passed, and Rivers Buller remains there. Buller had won the VC in the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879 for an act of great heroism, saving his mounted patrol from oncoming Zulus. But by the time of 1899 and the Boer War, he was no longer the man he had been. He had once been a very tall, broad, strong man, but years of desk work had turned his muscle into fat, and he was not a natural field commander. He was much better as a subordinate, personally extremely brave, had the common touch with soldiers, was much loved by his soldiers, in fact, but the responsibility of command weighed very heavily on him, and he was not a natural field commander. His efforts before to try and relieve Ladysmith have been criticised for being hesitant, for giving up at the first sign of difficulty, and for being badly planned, all to a greater or lesser extent valid criticisms. And Buller himself remained relatively pessimistic about his chances of fighting through that very difficult terrain across the river and beyond. But he had to find a way to do it, and this would lead to a revised British plan in the middle part of February 1900. Lord Roberts, now the Supreme Commander of the British Army in South Africa, was unequivocal about what he wanted Buller to do. Indeed, he instructed him in no uncertain terms that Buller needed to make a desperate effort to actually fight his way north to Ladysmith and lift this months-long siege. This is a different map, but the position is still the same. You can see the Tugela River running along here, and the town, very, very small town of Colenso here. And this is the rough, bushy country that you might remember from the first map. The difference in Buller's plan for the Battle of the Tugela Heights was that he would no longer try and simply fight his way across the river. You can note that the Boers have very, very strong fortifications on this side of the riverbank. Instead, he would hook right, and he would actually attack the Boers on their flank in this very difficult country, but he would seize the high ground on this flank. Notably, the Kop, the small hill in Afrikaans, but quite a large summit to British eyes, of Langwayne, to corrupt it into its Anglophone name, and also the peak of Monte Cristo. Langwayne, though, was the key. This overlooked the Boer position here, which you can see marked in green, and offered the possibility of pouring enfilade fire into them. If Langwayne fell, the Boers would have to fall back to the north, or their flank would be taken in enfilade and would be dealt with very severely. But this terrain was very, very difficult. Indeed, it still is very difficult terrain. I'll show you a picture of this terrain in a few slides' time so you can get an impression of just how tough this terrain is. And one of the reasons that Buller had not assaulted in this direction before was that the terrain was so difficult, he wasn't sure if he could actually fight his way through it. But now, facing desperate times always call for desperate measures. And so he was determined instead to hook right into this rough country, regardless of the cost, and turn the Boer flank. He had hopes that this would so demoralise the Boers, if he could take Luangwa, that they would fall back entirely, but if not, he would at least clear these river crossings and he could get forces across, and it would be a stepping stone, if you will, to a future offensive. What resources did the British have to actually carry out this offensive? Well, Buller's artillery park had grown considerably from his first efforts at Colenso. Remember that at Colenso, the loss of the 10 British guns actually constituted almost a quarter of Buller's available field artillery strength. So it was a very significant loss that set him back for some weeks. But by February 1900, artillery in various calibers had arrived, and he was able to muster some 76 guns, including 4 4.7-inch guns, naval guns on a converted carriage, but very long-ranged, indeed the only guns that could go toe-to-toe with the famous Boer long toms. The long toms, of course, 155mm French siege guns, or fortress guns more specifically. These 76 guns were a substantial improvement on the amount of artillery firepower that Buller had had at the outset of the campaign, and he would have need of them if he was going to assault into this very, very tough terrain. Coincidentally, and entirely by accident, 76 guns, including 4 heavy guns, was the same artillery complement of a British infantry division in 1914. Entirely accidental. There's no evidence that this was a direct influence, but it's one of those charming historical coincidences that simply has to be commented upon. By now, the artillerymen in Buller's army had learned a great deal about their craft. One thing that British artillery did in the early stages of the Boer War was underestimate the Boers, particularly Boer artillery, which I'll talk more about in a little while, and Boer entrenchments. And the tendency of British artillery up to this point in the war had been to carry out a preparatory bombardment on the Boers, which simply alerted the Boers an assault was imminent. Without inflicting sufficient damage, the artillery would then cease fire, would lift, the British infantry would attack, and the Boers would man their trenches and mow down the advancing British soldiers with their rifles. This, as we will see, was going to change at the Battle of the Tugela Heights. The British had learned that a preparatory bombardment and then simply sitting back, or perhaps trying to just search out isolated Boer guns, was not sufficient. The artillery was going to employ new methods at the Tugela Heights that would become decisive in the fighting that followed. The British infantry too had improved from the early months of the war. It's one of the first acts that Lord Roberts undertook when he arrived in South Africa was to issue a beautiful short memorandum entitled Notes for Guidance in South African Warfare, a booklet of sorts which offered simple, practical advice for tactics in this war zone. There's a great deal of debate about the extent to which the British Army was tactically prepared for the fighting it faced in South Africa. What's clear is, even though some units were prepared for this type of fighting, a large number were not, and they had endured a very steep and very bloody learning curve, getting to grips with an enemy, the Boers, who had smokeless weaponry and certainly knew how to handle rifles and indeed artillery. Roberts's Notes for Guidance in South African Warfare established certain key principles: maximum use of cover, wide extensions for assaulting infantry so they were not such easy targets for the Boers, dashes from cover to cover with the fire of one group covering the next, and close support from the artillery, albeit not too close. He did not want a repeat of Colonel Long's disaster at Colenso. This was practical advice, but for Buller's army, in many ways, it just codified what they had learned from their 3 previous battles. Buller's army had been fighting hard whilst Lord Roberts was even en route. They had learned tough lessons, simple lessons that seem so obvious now, but were not clear in October 1899. The need for officers to abandon their swords or else fall victim to Boer snipers, the need for the use of cover, the importance of covering fire to facilitate movement, and the need to keep moving. The risk of being pinned down by Boer fire was acute, and once your British forces were in that position, it was extraordinarily difficult to move. How would you free up troops that were pinned down? Through the covering fire either of artillery or indeed other British units. And these were tough lessons that the British had had to learn from the hard hand of experience. So both the British artillery and the British infantry were much improved by experience in February 1900, and they would have need of that experience in the fighting that would follow. What of the Boers who opposed them? Well, the Boer commander was this man, Louis Botha, just 37, at the time of the Battle of Tugela Heights. He would go on to, of course, be a great war hero in South Africa and indeed President of South Africa in the post-Boer War era. For a man who had no formal military experience, he was certainly a skilled commander, understood ground extremely well, understood motivating his troops, had deftly parried away Buller's lunges in the direction of Ladysmith throughout the campaign up to this point. Botha was one of those rare things, a man with no military experience who simply fitted into the military mould, or rather like a hand into a glove. He was a natural at this, and he learned his own lessons too. But by February 1900, he was beginning to have his doubts about his ability to hold off Buller. His scouts told him that Buller had been greatly reinforced. This was true. Particularly, they noted the increase in artillery strength. Again, absolutely true. And his own Boers were beginning to suffer from the pressures of what had been to this stage, a war that was approaching its 6th month. Nevertheless, Botha had some impressive tools at his disposal, and he would need all of them if he was going to hold off Buller's last desperate offensive. At the heart of Botha's army lay the Boers themselves. A wonderful colorized photo here. This is Boers in December 1899, giving you an impression of the lack of uniform, the alternative sort of modes of clothes, but also, I think, getting across what a rugged outdoors people the Boers often were. It's not entirely true to simply characterize the Boers as men who rode and were good shots. There were also plenty of urban Boers as well, but what the even urban Boers had in abundance was a certain rugged, individualistic outlook on life. This made them sometimes difficult to control and not really subject to military discipline, but also gave them a self-reliance and a determination to fight, which was almost instinctual and was certainly ingrained in Boer culture. Combined with their rather dour, almost apocalyptic Old Testament religion, it was an important source of morale. That desire to be independent and protect the home and the hearth, combined with a certain pessimistic Old Testament religion, made the Boers quite a resilient fighting force, despite, of course, their lack of formal training. Boers themselves, burghers here, citizens, had no formal military training. What they did have was a culture of marksmanship. Rifle shooting was immensely popular in South Africa in the 1890s, and the South African government, the Boer governments, I should say, had equipped many of their citizens with the latest German Mauser rifles, or indeed you could bring your own rifle if you preferred. These natural shooting skills were what made the Boers famous, along with their famed horse-borne mobility. That mobility was of less use on the Colenso front, where the battles had largely been static, or at least semi-static, compared to, say, the battles in the Orange Free State, fought over wide open spaces where mobility was paramount. And although the mobility of the Boers on the Colenso front was still important, it was not their defining attribute. Instead, what made Botha's Boers so powerful was their determination to fight and their ability to deliver astounding rates of rifle fire with high accuracy at long ranges. This had been what had destroyed Colonel Long's batteries at Colenso, or at least driven the crews back, and it had inflicted so many casualties on the British in their assaults up to this point. But as Botha recognised, these Boers were becoming tired. They were not a military force, and as much as their informal morale would hold them in place, they were becoming exhausted as the war approached its 6th month, and they had been engaged in some fierce fighting. The battles had not been without cost for the Boers, and although Colenso had been a terribly one-sided engagement, Spionkop and Valkrans had been rather harder fought, and had cost the Boers casualties, and above all else had simply exhausted the Boers. The Boers were not anticipating, or indeed prepared for a war of this duration or this intensity. And indeed, on the eve of the Battle of the Tugela Heights, Botha recommended that the Tugela line be abandoned, and indeed the siege of Ladysmith be lifted naturally by the Boers to allow them time to regroup and prepare to defend their homelands. But he was denied this opportunity. His Boers, tired as they were, would have to hold the line. Supporting his burghers were the Boer artillery. This was the only formally trained aspect of the Boer military. Boer gunners effectively were full-time professionals for much of their military service, and the commanders of the Boer artillery often went to Europe for actually the special schools, usually hosted in Germany, but sometimes in France, where they could learn the latest artillery techniques. The Boers were massively outgunned at the Tugela Heights. Some of their artillery was to the north at Ladysmith, carrying out rather ineffectual bombardments of the town, and Botha only had under his command 12 guns, including a single long tom, plus 3 pom-pom guns, small autocannons that fired a 1-pound explosive shell. These were not insignificant weapons and indeed caused considerable concern to the British. But you can see that his artillery park was greatly outgunned. But the Boers had learned a number of important lessons about the value of artillery. Their victory at Spion Kop owed a great deal to the daring handling of field artillery, which was able to pour enfilade fire into the British lines. Boer gunners had learned their craft. They were adept at avoiding counter-battery fire, employing a whole range of tricks and techniques to deceive the Royal Artillery into pouring fire onto empty positions. These included, for example, detonating a flask which produced a cloud of smoke which inevitably drew the eye of British gunners, who then poured fire onto what was actually an empty position. The Boers were also very adept at moving their guns from pit to pit, opening fire in different positions and eluding the best efforts of the British to try and silence their guns. And although there were only 12 guns available, and one of them at least, the long tom, was not especially mobile, the ability of the Boers to handle their guns with such daring actually made them quite a formidable foe, and they're extremely difficult for the Royal Artillery to silence. Finally, the Boers also had the advantage of some defences. This is a really wonderful photo of Boers. They're obviously posing for the camera, but nevertheless, a Boer trench at Peter's Hill. Now, take notice of the stone parapet that runs along here. This trench was actually a converted area that had been, a wall that had been put up to separate grazing lands for sheep, which were being, before the war, being grazed here. But the Boers were adept at constructing trenches. They took with them what was a sort of a labour corps of Africans, rather impressed Africans, it must be said, who would carry out the manual work under Boer direction. The Boers were very good at sighting their trenches and also ensuring that they were resilient to British artillery fire, and also provided maximum protection, not to mention concealment. Boer concealment of trenches was something of a revelation for the British in this theatre. The inability to locate Boer trenches before assaults had been a serious problem in the early part of the Boer War. This trench here that runs along a position known as Peter's Hill, which I'll point out to you later, was in some ways the Boers' main position. This stone parapet made it easier to observe, but it also, of course, gave the Boers some hard cover from which they could hide behind. And on the other side of the wall, whoops, we'll go back one. On the other side of that wall, of course, it had also been lowered so they could shelter more easily from artillery fire. And for shrapnel that was bursting above it, of course, the shrapnel coming down at an angle rather than plunging, this gave the Boers an enormous amount of protection from incoming British fire. Only high explosive or lyddite shells could do any real damage to that wall. And so the use of these kind of stone walls was very popular in Boer positions. So this was, despite the weaknesses, despite the tiring of the Boers, despite the fact that they were outnumbered, they were nevertheless in a very tough position. They had sighted their trenches well, their artillery was daringly handled, and their citizen soldiers, tired as they were, beginning to lose heart as they were still capable of fighting very, very hard from their defensive positions. It was clear, and the Battle of Valkrans had proved this, that even if they were tired, they still had plenty of bite and could drive back the British if the British attacked in an incompetent or ill-organised fashion. So the stage was set for the Battle of the Tugela Heights. One thing before I get into the maps again is to comment on the terrain. This is a photo, it's actually taken from the British side of the Tugela River. You can see the Tugela River at the bottom. And you can see troops moving up the slopes. This gives you some impression of how deep these valleys were and how rugged this terrain was. Notice that the scrub vegetation here, you can also, if you look very closely, you can see certain rocks and other outcroppings. But much of this is pretty open and pretty fire swept in the event of crossing. Notice too that even if once you've scaled these heights from the river, you can see another cop in the background. This type of terrain dominates the Tugela Heights, going from one height to the next, and so on and so forth. And what the Boers, of course, possessed was the ability to dig pretty effective field fortifications on these high points and so on, which made them such a tough nut to crack. This is difficult terrain to assault into. It is a terrain that in many ways favours the defender and certainly does the attacker no favours. Another point to bear in mind is that this battle was taking place in February 1900. This is the height of the South African summer. Any of you who've been in South Africa in February will know exactly what I mean. And for those of you who haven't, the temperature frequently hits 40 degrees Celsius or more. The wind brings no relief. The wind itself is almost like a sirocco. It's a hot wind. The evenings can be very stormy. It can be humid. There's many, many flies, especially around river areas, flies and mosquitoes. And above all else, when the sky is clear and the sun beats down upon you, it is truly brutalizingly hot. And even veterans of India and the Northwest frontier commented on how brutal the heat was during the Tugela River fighting, and how multitudinous the flies were down by the river itself. And of course, you're relatively close to the river, no matter what side of the river you're on. Mosquitoes and flies were a constant menace for the soldiers. This was a brutal terrain and brutal weather, not a pleasant place to be carrying out a campaign, even for an army that was well experienced in these type of operations. So let's talk a little bit once more about the battle itself. The battle really had two essential parts to it. The first was going to be this hook to the right around Langwayne Hill. This was fighting into very, very steep, rugged terrain. It was difficult terrain, but the one advantage that the British had was that it was on the extreme end of the Boer line. Now you can see the Boer line approximately in green here. The Boers were stretched. One thing I didn't get across to you was that the Boers could only muster about 5,000 infantry preparing to face this assault. By contrast, Buller had somewhere in the region of 20,000 to 25,000 infantry and cavalry available to support him. So he had a grand numerical advantage. The Boers could not defend everywhere. They had previously defended the river line very strongly, and they were certainly aware of the value of Langwayne, but they simply didn't have the forces necessary to completely screen this area. Furthermore, it was difficult to keep the defenders in this position supplied. They're quite a long way from the main Boer supply base, which was to the north of the Tugela River. So Boers out on this position felt rather isolated. They were a bit worried that they were going to be cut off. One of the great fears in the Boer military mind is the idea of being surrounded and cut off. This is a cultural fear that owes a great deal actually to the wars against native Africans, Zulus, Xhosa, and so forth, where to be cut off by Zulus or Xhosa meant death. And so the fear that the Boers had of being cut off, which seemed disproportionate to British observers, owed a great deal to that cultural fear. And not to mention, of course, this was reinforced by what had happened at the Battle of Ilansgate in October 1899, where retreating Boers or Boers in disarray had been charged by lancers and had been speared, much to the horror of the Boer military. So the defenders of Langwayne and indeed the Monte Cristo position were out on a limb, so to speak. They're in a rather difficult position. They weren't entirely confident in their position. The trenches at this position were basic. There were scrapes rather than lines. And it had something of the appearance of an extended picket line rather than a main Boer position. The main position, of course, ran along the Tugela River. Buller's hook swung into this position at the outset of the battle on the 18th of February, 1900. In contrast to previous British offensives in this sector, where Buller has been accused, largely correctly, of attacking on too narrow a front, this time he attacked with on a relatively broad front, several battalions with cavalry support, advanced in strength with a great deal of artillery, playing upon the slopes of these positions. This was a heavy assault pressed forward with considerable determination. In particular, notice Dundonald, this man, Lord Dundonald, seeking a flanking route around the back of Monte Cristo with his horsemen. The sight of these horsemen beginning to lap around the flank of the Boers caused considerable alarm, and combined with a very determined infantry assault up the slopes of the hills, cavalry seeming to slip round their flanks, this was perfectly calculated to unsettle the Boers and cause fear. Botha had little option in terms of reinforcing this. Once this position was taken, once the slopes were beginning to crumble, it was very difficult to reinforce. Remember, the Boers have no tradition of counterattacking. They are largely a defensive force, reliant on firepower. They don't have any kind of assault culture. They have no training to promote assault culture. So it's difficult, though not impossible, for them to counterattack. And so as this position begins to crumble and he's gradually driven back, Botha has few options. Sending reinforcements out there is likely to just have his reinforcements gobbled up, and simply asking his troops to hold is improbable. Nevertheless, this fighting around this position, the first phase of the Battle of the Tugela Heights, is hard fought indeed. Illustration here, quite an accurate illustration in many ways. The British storming the heights of Flogged Hill. There's certain liberties been taken here, but a few things that are quite accurate. Notice the rocks. Notice that it's difficult to climb here. You can see the fallen Boer in a trench here. Again, the Boers had entrenched on Flogged Hill. These gentlemen up here surrendering in their trench, apparently about to get bayoneted, maybe not quite so accurate. And of course, everything's much closer than it actually was. But the last Boer defenders on Flogged Hill actually fought very hard, almost to the last moment. Some were indeed apparently bayoneted, trying to defend their positions before being overrun. It was hard fighting. It cost the British several hundred casualties to fight through this rough, difficult terrain. Against a determined snap-shooting, sharp-shooting opponent in the form of the Boers. But this very determined assault, Dundonald's cavalry flanking and sufficient artillery support was enough to actually allow the British to seize this crucial high ground and turn the battle on its head. I'm going to go back now to this map, because the really interesting, from an artillery point of view at least, phase of the battle was about to begin. Buller now had options. He'd taken this rough high ground. Flogged Hill compromised the Boer line here, and Botha, recognising this, fell back onto a line that ran along here, falling back up the slopes, surrendering the river crossings over Colenso, and instead occupying the high ground that overlooked them. Buller had options. Some of his subordinates urged him to continue this flanking move. Some of this terrain to the north is actually quite flat, it's quite open. It was felt that would be quite good terrain to deploy cavalry into, to try and turn the Boers out of their fixed defensive position here. Buller certainly mulled this, but in the end he decided to reject it. And there's various reasons why he rejected it. One, he didn't think he had sufficient cavalry. Two, he was conscious that this would potentially take him into difficult terrain. Although that's flat there, it soon becomes rather harder, and the Boers would simply stall him again. Buller also may, although he didn't write this down himself, may have also perceived he now had an opportunity to deal serious damage to the Boers, who had been quite elusive up until this stage. And there were two reasons why he had this opportunity. The first was that by surrendering these river crossings, Buller could put troops across there for the first time since the campaign had begun. They still had a daunting task. They would have to assault directly uphill into the face of Boer trenches, but nevertheless, they would at least be across the river. And knowing that the Boers had no culture of counter-attacking, the relatively small British bridgehead across that river was in no real danger of being driven back into the water. So Buller could make a bridgehead, and indeed he chose to do so. This forced the Boers, of course, to separate their defenders. They now had to defend across this position here, where Buller was crossing infantry, and also here, where it was quite clear that Buller was prepared to assault across. This part of the Tugela River, incidentally, although at the bottom of a deep valley, it's actually quite it narrows quite significantly, and it's reasonably fordable. It still needs pontoons, but the fact that it's narrow makes it easier to get across, and Buller indeed had his engineers throw pontoons across. But here's the real advantage that Buller and indeed his artillerymen perceived. By taking this high ground here, for the first time really since the campaign had begun, it gave the British artillery a really good position. You can see the guns or battery layouts marked here, where although they couldn't overlook the Boers as such, they nevertheless could occupy positions that gave them roughly approximate height with the Boer lines on the opposite side of the Tugela River. There was good observation on the Flogged side, and Flogged itself is actually the highest sort of peak of this ridgeline, and observers there using telescopes and binoculars could have a very, very good view of the Boer artillery position and could signal, although this was somewhat limited, it was limited to the work of the 4.7-inch guns, could actually try and signal to the guns the fall of shot using heliographs, which of course use the sun to send signals. An imperfect system, but nevertheless an interesting beginning of indirect fire in a way. The British were also able to deploy howitzers into this area, an extremely useful asset on this part of the Boer War front, because their plunging fire and their high explosive was, of course, exactly what was needed to deal with a well-entrenched enemy. And as well handled as the 15-pounder field guns were, they only fired shrapnel, which, if you remember, the Boer trenches, and particularly their use of parapets, very difficult to inflict any damage on Boers in trenches such as that using shrapnel alone. The howitzers, with their plunging fire, could drop shells into those trenches and cause significant damage, whereas their high explosive could shatter parapets and indeed make parapets a lethal danger for the defenders by flinging stones at high speed in many unpredictable directions. Those 76 guns that Buller now had in his force, almost all of them were deployed. Indeed, all 76 actually eventually found positions in and around this area of the Tugela riverbank, now in a great position, not to overlook the Boers, I stress that, but to have a view of the Boer trenches. And the Boer trenches were, although well concealed, the British had perceived correctly that the Boers usually sighted their trenches for the best possible rifle fire. And this meant that they almost invariably occupied summits or the forward, in this case, most of the Boer positions were on the forward slopes of these copse. The reason for this, of course, is so the Boers could develop maximum rifle fire, but it also made them vulnerable to this very powerful artillery park, which was now forming on the other side of the river. And this took some days. This took quite a long time. It was not done. It was not done overnight. There was some criticism of Buller for taking his time doing this, but he was, of course, laying the table for a set-piece battle, which would look awfully modern given in the light of the First World War. He positioned his infantry now across the river. He'd established a bridgehead across the river here. His infantry was in position. A powerful artillery park was waiting behind him. And although the Boers themselves had dug in and had prepared their artillery as well, they were about to face a very significant, and in many ways a very modern assault. And now we come to the quotation which I've taken the title for this talk from, simply flogged by lead. The Royal Artillery was going to prepare this battle in a way that it had never done before, as well as mustering more guns for a bombardment than at any point up to the British Army's experience in South Africa, and delivering the heaviest bombardment perhaps in the Royal Artillery's history in terms of weight of shell. The artillery also had a new tactical approach to how they were going to undertake this firing. You can get a view, this is quite an accurate illustration of British guns firing across the Tugela River. In some cases, the guns were pushed relatively close to the river itself, perhaps not as close as this illustration, but it gives you an impression of the bombardment as it was being carried out. The difference, though, was that this was not simply a preparatory bombardment that would end the moment the British infantry began to attack. Instead, for the first time, the British infantry and artillery achieved a high degree of cooperation. Rather than firing a bombardment and then lifting and perhaps simply trying to find Boer artillery, instead the field guns would maintain a constant fire upon the Boer trenches. Remember, those Boer trenches have been identified to a large extent now because of the control of the high ground on the south side of the Tugela River. The artillery's plan was to maintain fire, keep fire up upon those Boer trenches until the very last second. And by that, I truly mean the last second. Some of the advice that was circulated for the Royal Artillery suggested firing until the British artillery had disappeared into the smoke. Others firing not merely until the last minute, but until the last second, the last possible second until the bayonets went in, the fire would be maintained. And this, of course, would keep the Boers' heads down. It would prevent them from developing their own firepower against the advancing British infantry. Remember that infantry's got to fight its way uphill across rugged terrain that's ideally suited to a defender. So it's imperative that the Royal Artillery kept its fire up. The heavier pieces, the 4.7-inch guns, would cooperate in this bombardment, but they would also try and search for Boer artillery and try and silence it. Boer artillery, of course, had been very lethal, particularly at the Battle of Spionkop, and needed to be dealt with. But the field guns and the howitzers would pour their fire onto onto the Boer lines, actually firing directly over the heads of the British. In the words of the orders that were given to them, they were ordered to pitch their shells well up, but allow them to fall down onto the Boer lines. And for a Boer veteran, Boers who were facing this type of fire, this was something very new, this continuous firing in the midst of a battle by so many guns that were now zeroed in very well upon their positions. This was something entirely different. And the Boers were their firepower was beaten down in many ways as the British advanced. Louis Botha, commenting upon this battle, reported that his burghers, his soldiers, were simply flogged by lead, of course the lead bursting from shrapnel and pouring down upon them. And as much as the Boers might cling to their trenches, no force, outnumbered as they were, tired as they were, could resist this type of well-coordinated assault. Thomas Pakenham, in his book The Boer War, suggests that this was a creeping barrage. Not quite true, but the principles behind it do owe something to the creeping barrages of the First World War. The importance of maintaining fire until the last second to allow infantry to close with an enemy trench and prevent what would later become known as the race to the parapet, of course. There was, of course, a risk of friendly fire, shells falling short. There's certainly some casualties were reported by British infantry being suffered by friendly fire as shells did plunge short. But the general feeling at the end of this battle was that those casualties that were suffered by friendly fire, as unfortunate and as unwelcome as they were a small price to pay in comparison to the casualties that would have been suffered had the assault gone in under the normal system of a preparatory bombardment and then what was essentially an unsupported infantry assault following up. This artillery bombardment, this artillery work, perhaps not a creeping barrage, but certainly this cooperation, the intensity of fire, looked extremely modern, and it was able to overcome what was an extremely tough Boer position. British infantry stormed the heights on the 27th of February, taking Peters Hill. That's where the trench I showed you earlier was sited, breaking the Boer line and ultimately breaking Louis Botha's force. The Boers, overwhelmed, exhausted, hammered by artillery, unable to halt the British advance, panicked in many cases and fell back in considerable disarray. And although Botha would rally and reorganise them, it was clear that the defence of the Tugela River was over, that there was no possibility of holding off Buller's force from advancing on Ladysmith. And Botha's force fell back in some disarray. He did rally it, but he picked up along with the Ladysmith besiegers, they too fell back and the siege was lifted. It had been broken in this fortnight-long battle, effectively, from the 14th of February to the 28th of February, but the culminating moment was on the 27th of February, at this grand assault across the Tugela Heights, capturing Peters Hill and breaking the Boer line. And this, of course, leads to victory. Ladysmith relieved on the 28th of February, famous painting of this here, the Boers falling back to the north. And although there'll be much hard fighting still to come, this was a defining moment and a great moment for Buller himself, who of course had faced very, very stiff criticism, not indeed unwarranted for his efforts trying to fight his way north. But now he'd finally broken the Boers, and he'd done so in extremely difficult terrain against a very tough and hardy opponent. And it was a battle of which the army and the artillery especially could be very proud. It had not come without cost, and you can just see this soldier's face here if you're struggling to perceive this image. Some fallen British soldiers amongst the rocks of the Tugela Heights. For the British, the casualties were 2,182 across the entire battle. The Boers suffered perhaps 500, but I put a plus here to indicate that the exact casualties are unclear or unknown. It's not entirely clear how many men were lost, but somewhere in this region fell. This actually makes this Battle of the Tugela Heights across its 2 weeks the bloodiest battle that the British Army fought on the Natal front. And it gives you some idea about how, even with this artillery support, this was still very, very bitter fighting against a very, very skilled opponent. But this was the cost that was needed to fight through such a difficult Boer position. But victory had been won, even if it had been at a cost. And it wasn't merely the victory that had been won, it was the lessons that had been learned. These men did not die in vain, they did not fall in vain. The British Army and the artillery in particular took great interest, at least for some years, in the events of the Tugela Heights. Some of these lessons would go on to inform Royal Artillery thinking right up to the First World War, and indeed during the First World War as well. Many of the principles that have been developed at the Tugela Heights, the need for very close infantry artillery cooperation, the importance of suppressing enemy trenches to prevent their defenders occupying the parapet and raining fire on the attackers, and the need for a mixture of shrapnel to cause suppression and high explosives to cause destruction, were all perceived by the Royal Artillery. And of course, you don't need me to tell you that these lessons would be of immense importance in the First World War, particularly as the British faced the German trench lines. Of course, the scale of battle was very different in Tugela, but I think we see a glimpse here of modernity, a glimpse of modern war, and a glimpse of the type of war that was to come. The Boers were not the Germans. They did not possess machine guns. Their artillery park was tiny. They had no culture of counterattack, for example. But many of the other features would be repeated in the First World War. Tough entrenchment, hard fighting opponents, the difficulty of advancing across ground that was hard to cross and relatively devoid of cover, and above all else, the absolute essential nature of artillery support in wars of the 20th century. I think it's significant that this battle fought within just the second month of the 1900s, in many ways is a forerunner, a portent, if you will, or a prophecy perhaps, of the type of fighting that will become very common in the First World War. At that point, I will be very happy to take any questions you may have. But before I take any questions, I'd like to draw your attention to this picture. This is the same trench that I showed you before, except this time we're looking at it from effectively the Boer side. You can see the parapet here, so there's dirt and other things thrown on it, but what I really would like to draw your attention to is notice the shell holes. And the blast marks, particularly that shell hole I'd like to draw your attention to, which gives you some idea of the damage, of course, that had been poured upon the Boer trenches during this attack. At that point, I'll be delighted to receive any questions that you may have.
Spencer, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for a superb, absolutely superb lecture. Let's kick off with some questions then, in the time that we have remaining. I note from the participants, we have a few members of 29 Commando here, so people familiar with Oakhampton. When you go to Oakhampton, there are a series of trenches which the history room of Oakhampton battle camp says are Boer War experimental trenches. What would be interested is in going back to your HE versus shrapnel comments, the lessons. Are you able to offer anything on experimentation? And the reason I say that is it is clear, if you go and visit Oakhampton, that stuff was going on, that experiments were happening back in the UK using British artillery against the type of field defences that were found in South Africa. Would you be able to offer anything on that element? Thank you.
Absolutely. There's actually two stories I'd share about this. The first is that very quickly after Black Week, news came back to Britain that there was serious problems, that the Boer trenches were, at the time, were almost considered immune to Boer fire, British fire. And in some ways they were, because of the lack of HE to actually cause any damage to them. And one of the first things that actually happens is, based on reports of Boer trenches are constructed at Oakhampton and test firing is carried out upon them. I've read, these articles were actually written sometime after this, though still before the First World War, suggesting that dummies were actually placed in the trenches in sort of approximate firing positions, and shoots were carried out against them, and then the trench was inspected to see if people were being, the dummies had been struck by shrapnel. And the information that came out was it was extremely hard to inflict shrapnel casualties on trenches. Now that may seem very obvious to us now. The British Army had no real experience of facing trenches in this, certainly of this sophistication and manned by men with these modern weapons. So these experiments took place. And these experiments were then used to inform units that went out to South Africa. So there was almost a learning process in the UK that would then feed into the South African experience. And this type of use of experimental trenches is not unique to the Boer War. Before the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, of course, a famous artillery shoot by the British, in the winter, in the early winter of 1914-15, back in Oakhampton again, dummy trenches had been constructed based on reports of what German trenches looked like. And shoots were carried out against them to try and determine how much damage they could take. And it was found then that a mixture of high explosive and shrapnel it was believed would shatter German trenches. So I think the legacy of the Boer War trenches that were being constructed in late 1899 and early 1900, you can trace a direct line into then the experiments of 1914-15.
Spencer, thank you. And I think some of us actually slept in those trenches during the commando course. And therefore, we can confirm that dummies are still placed in those trenches even to this day. The second question is actually about the Russo-Japanese War, but it's more coming back to the lessons. And I might just skew this because you talked about the lessons in some detail about what was taken away. But the Russo-Japanese War is interesting. Of course, it's the IDF debate. It's about gun shields and many other things, and about how relevant they are to the European theatre.
Mm.
In your scholarship, has anything been forgotten? You think? What lessons were of interest to the British from the Boer War, but fell by the wayside and were then learnt the hard way once again a decade later?
I think the Russo-Japanese War is really interesting as a sort of case study. And one thing that I would really emphasize about the Russo-Japanese War is European observers, and it's not unique to the British, Germans and the French do it, that there's a real tendency for observers to go over there and interpret the war to confirm whatever they believe. There's definitely confirmation bias. Remember that military observation at this stage is very informal in many ways. You're simply, you're lucky enough to be sent out, tell us something interesting. There's no sort of formal process to it. And so lots of observers go out and they observe the Russo-Japanese War, but it tends to confirm their biases already. But if there's one misinterpreted lesson, or perhaps not misinterpreted, perhaps it leads to a forgetting of some of the difficulties of the Boer War, it's to do with the ability to assault trenches. Now, the Russians are not the Boers. They've got a number of military differences. They're generally considered to be quite poorly trained. They don't have a culture of marksmanship and things. The Japanese are able to repeatedly successfully assault the Russians, albeit at high cost. It costs a lot of casualties to assault a trench. But the big lesson from the Russo-Japanese War seems to be it's possible to carry trenches, even ones that seem quite sophisticated and quite heavily defended, with sufficient willpower, with sufficient courage or willingness to just press through enemy fire. Now, it is possible to take trenches. The British have taken it to Tugela Heights. What I think the lesson that gets lost is how important it is to cooperate between infantry and artillery. And a message seems to get back, more so on continental Europe than Britain, message seems to get back that the really important thing in taking a trench is not the cooperation of infantry and artillery, because that's difficult, it's sophisticated, it takes a lot of time. Instead, it's willpower, it's the courage to actually assault a trench. And this is a misunderstanding. In some ways, it's easier to simply emphasize this. It's got ease for training. You don't have to try and coordinate your infantry and artillery. But that is a dangerous strand of thought. I would say it's not universal, though. Even after the Russo-Japanese War, there are certainly British officers who would point out that this isn't true. Ian Hamilton, of course, whose reputation will be destroyed at Gallipoli, writes very pertinently that he's watched Japanese assaults go in, and he says if they tried this against the Boers, no man would have made it to 300 yards because the firepower would be too much. And he cautions you cannot assault a trench without artillery support. But others, perhaps more distant from the war, actually take this as a vindication that it is about courage above all else, rather than coordination, rather than the sophisticated elements of war. More so, I would say, in France and Germany, but it does produce a strand in Britain, in the British Army, that's debated right up to the outbreak of the war.
Thank you indeed. The third question has come in, and this is very close to my own heart, actually, from my previous job, is ammunition consumption. Calculations, lessons. And I'm just trying to rack my brain. It was in one of your lectures which we circulated, I think it's 1913 one, Readying the Rapier.
Yes.
You talked about the BEF deployed with something like 75 minutes worth of firepower. Can you offer a view on how ammunition consumption over this battle and other battles in the Boer War might have therefore led to such a staggering miscalculation of what modern war might require?
That's a really, really good question about ammunition tables are completely wrong for every army in Europe. The underestimation of firepower is staggering. And one lesson that comes very clearly from the Boer War is ammunition expenditure is enormous compared to what's expected. You have single batteries firing more rounds than have been fired in the entirety of the Crimean War, for example. And although I didn't mention this, one of the key features of the Tugela Heights assault, particularly the final assault at Peters Hill, is this assemblage of an enormous amount of ammunition, due to some very, very good logistics work, I might add, and assembling enough to maintain this level of firepower. Afterwards, incidentally, there was some speculation that the artillery would not be able to have a shoot like that again for at least a fortnight, because the ammunition would need to be brought back up. British ammunition tables actually get changed in light of the Russia-Japanese War, where once again the amount of ammunition expended is astronomical, even greater than the Boer War. But it's felt that that's all that will be needed. And what I will say is I think that there's a little bit of making the wish the father of the thought, if you're familiar with that phrase, in that to increase the level of ammunition supply is going to cost a lot of money, especially given that the Royal Artillery has re-equipped itself. So you can't use Boer War surplus. You've gone from 15-pounders to 18-pounders and so on. And so these guns need new ammunition. You can't simply recycle surplus stock. So to produce sufficient weight of ammunition is going to cost an absolute fortune. Incidentally, remember too that the army doesn't have its own way when it comes to ammunition supply. It's also in a sort of competition with the Royal Navy, which always has first refusal on ammunition supply. And the army is the poor cousin to the Navy. And so there's two things here. One, I think that basing the idea of ammunition consumption in the Russia-Japanese War is not wrong in itself, but nothing has changed. And the Russia-Japanese War fought quite far from the homelands of both armies at the end of relatively tenuous supply lines is nothing like the type of war that would be experienced on mainland Europe with all of its key rail networks. But to actually acknowledge that and then do something about it is going to cost an awful lot of money. And for an army that's constantly fighting budget cuts, this is not a battle it's willing to fight.
Sorry, can you just confirm, were you talking about the 1900s there, or were you talking about the integrated review at the moment?
Here we go.
First question has come in here about counter battery fire. We talked about the British, but what about the Boers against the British? Given the fact they could see this host forming up, did they look at were they able to spoil or attempt to spoil in some?
Well, that's an interesting question, because one thing that I think people forget, and in many ways what prompted this talk, is the Boers kept very good reports on their military activities up to about the end of February, and then as the retreat takes place, their paperwork starts to crumble and has really collapsed by the time of April. And so the origin of this talk is based on research I did years ago with Afrikaans language sources. And sadly, I've largely forgotten how to speak Afrikaans, but at the time when I did this, I was able to make a lot of notes, and I rediscovered these notes. And one of the things that's quite interesting is both Botha and some of his commando leaders and the Boer artillery send back reports that are almost lessons learned reports. And a number of things come out about the Boer artillery. Remember, they're professionals. They've been trained professionally. Their commanders, in many cases, have been trained in Europe. So they're a professional outfit. And the Boers, in some ways, take a lesson that is, it's correct in its own way, but it's also misleading and misleads them a little bit. And this comes from Spionkop, where Boer artillery has been extremely effective in getting into devastating positions and really being able to pour fire into a shallow British trench. And the Boer artillery take away from this and recognise if they can concentrate their guns, they're extremely effective at shooting at infantry. And in the aftermath of this, in fact, there's a report that goes back and says that we shouldn't, apart from long toms, which of course got huge range, shouldn't bother shooting at British artillery. It just draws us into counter-battery duels that we can't win. We're better off holding every shot for the infantry assault. Now, at the Tugela Heights, this massive British artillery is seen to be assembling, and it is harassed by the long tom. It does put some rounds into it, fires a few shots, but the field pieces, 11 or so of them, actually hold their fire. And the reason for this is it's felt better to save every shot and every shell for the incoming British offensive. Now, one of the things you might ask from this is, when the British attack starts up the slopes, what's the Boer artillery doing? Well, the Boer artillery actually fights quite daringly. It pushes its pom-pom guns forward quite close. Its field pieces open fire on the advancing British as well, and they do inflict casualties. And I can't prove this, but I suspect that some of the complaints about early friendly fire that you do find in certain British paperwork is actually them being hit by Boer shells. But there's so many shells bursting overhead, both British and Boer, it's not easy to tell where from. What happens though to the Boers is the British assault, previous British assaults into Boer lines have tended to become bogged down perhaps 300 or so yards from the Boer trenches, and then that's ideal for the Boer artillery to range in on them and start punishing those lines. But this time the assault doesn't get pinned down, it just keeps moving forward, and the Boers have to slacken their fire because of the fear of hitting their own forces. Again, you might think, why not switch to counter-battery fire? It's partially because the Boers have positioned their guns in such a way to avoid counter-battery themselves, so they're not really in a position to do it apart from the long tom. So that's a long answer to a question, but I hope one that you found interesting.
Perfect. Can we look at the any lessons taken forward on indirect versus direct fire? And this question also references the Boers' excellent use of pom-poms against the British field guns.
First of all, I think this is the definitive battle for howitzers in the Boer War. Howitzers, of course, appear in late 1899, but they're initially not considered the ideal weapon. It's supposed to be a very mobile war, but howitzers are beautifully handled by Hamilton Gordon, who commands the howitzer force here, really proved their worth, the ability to actually undertake what we would now, what was termed later after the war, scientific fire. So not firing over open sights, but actually firing indirect, having plunging fire. How's this fire observed? Well, again, the possession of Flogged Hill has that. I alluded to that in the lecture. And the observation post on Flogged Hill it's crude. It is crude. You've got a group of officers there with a heliograph which signals via the sun. It's not perfect in any means, but it does offer an early form of correcting indirect fire in real time. It's not perfect by any means, but it is effective. And Hamilton Gordon becomes a real proponent of indirect fire. And if any of you, once all the pandemic is over, are interested in this, he wrote a number of very interesting articles about it that appear in the Royal Artillery Journal in the interwar period. He was a great artist, he was really in favour of it, and indeed more could have perhaps been done with indirect fire had it not been for the fact that this battle, this particular battlefront, was really the only battlefront where indirect fire played a major role. You could make a case for the Battle of Paardeberg out in the Western Theatre, but that was a peculiar battle in slightly different comparison. And so howitzers themselves only had their moment in the sun really on the Natal front. And for reasons that are long and complex, and I won't get into too much, the fighting in the Natal front got downplayed after the war, partially because Buller's reputation was under attack and so on, in favour of Roberts's campaign in the West. Roberts much better at handling the press than Buller, already had this sort of popular appeal. And so a lot of the fighting on the Natal front became the preserve of specialists and those who had a specialist interest. But this really was proof of concept that indirect howitzer fire could be very effective. Questions about the pom-pom guns and being used against British artillery and indeed infantry. Pom-poms had two really big advantages for the Boers. The first was their noise. Now, this may seem slightly counterintuitive, but pom-poms, as the name implies, make a very, very distinctive noise. For Boers who could hear a friendly pom-pom coming into action, there's many accounts that this really boosted the morale, to know a pom-pom was on your side. And equally, it could depress British morale as well. The second thing that the pom-pom did, aside from having a frightening direct effect, it's firing small 1-pound shells, which will very, very good at knocking out light objects and so on, causes small explosions. If it hits somebody, it inflicts appalling wounds, which of course are terrifying to those around them. But in terms of being used against British artillery, it's not merely the fire of the pom-poms which is a problem for British guns. It's the fact that Boers become very adept at using pom-pom fire as a ranging tool. And you find this time and time again in all theatres of the war, both West and East, that sometimes Boers can be firing their rifles and they're not having a lot of effect, but when a pom-pom comes into action, they can use the kick of the dust and the pom-pom gunners will communicate the fall of shot. And suddenly, as a British battery, you're not merely under pom-pom fire, you're also now under sniper fire and Boer rifle fire as well. And these pom-pom guns are handled very daringly. Remember, they're handled by professional gunners. their mobility, considering they're on quite large carts, is absolutely remarkable. And the Boers certainly run a lot of risks getting them close to the foreign line and handling them very, very bravely indeed.
Perfect. Well, Spencer, just as the final question, I'd love to wheel out the one that I put on that 4-step instruction of how to access tonight. Douglas Haig, am I wrong in thinking that, in terms of what I've read, that he might have taken some slightly different interpretations of the artillery as a result of his experiences in the Boer War?
There's certainly an argument in that direction, and I'd be cautious about condemning Haig for this. Haig doesn't fight on this particular front. He's down in the Cape Midland. That's a very mobile campaign. It's horseman dominated, where speed is absolutely the essence. He doesn't see this type of almost a siege-like warfare fighting through fixed positions. And so he comes away with the idea about speed, about mobility, about the importance of forward momentum in attack rather than methodical methods. And we can't be too quick to criticise Haig for that, but his experience in the Boer War had been built around these ideas. He hadn't seen the fighting that had gone on in Natal. And as I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, the fighting in Natal was somewhat downplayed after the war, and it really was the preserve of specialists more so than having the level of perhaps recognition that it deserved, I think, if you will.
Perfect. Well, Spencer, I think we've come to the natural conclusion for this evening. The fact that we're 11 minutes over can only be a tribute to the chef and the quality of the dish that you placed before us. On behalf of all of us in the Royal Artillery Historical Society, thank you very much for showing us, the lead in terms of how we should do these things. It's been extremely valuable in terms of everything that you've said. I'll leave you with this thought. And again, I'm going back to a personal experience here, and it's the development of a new piece of equipment that will ultimately replace the AS-90. And when we did the calculations of how many guns we felt we needed in the divisional artillery group, the answer was 76. I leave you with that thought. I did not know that it was 76 guns for Buller's force, as you've demonstrated tonight, but how extraordinary.
That is
the answer we came to 120 years later was 76. I leave you that thought. Spencer, have an excellent evening. We look forward to doing more of these. But to everybody out there, thank you for joining us this evening, and have an excellent week.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.